Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. This evening, I am talking about a recent acquisition at the Frick Collection, an object that was acquired in 2011, and which is one of the great pieces of porcelain at the Frick. Henry Clay Frick was a great collector of Sèvres French porcelain from the 18th century. And this is the most recent acquisition in that field, which is known as the Vase Japon. I'm pairing this object with a Long Island iced tea. Long Island iced teas were supposedly invented in the 1970s in Long Island, but it is likely that it is based on an earlier drink that existed already in America in the 1920s at the time of Prohibitionism. It is a very strong drink. It is made out of equal parts of gin, vodka, tequila, rum, triple sec, with a splash of Coca-Cola on the rocks. Cheers. A Long Island iced tea has as much to do with iced tea as the Vase Japon has to do with Japan. In fact, we don't really know why this object is known as a Vase Japon, as a Japanese vase, because its links are really entirely with China. So this is an occasion to talk a little bit about the relationship in the second half of the 18th century between the court of Versailles and the Louis XV in France and the court of the Qianlong Emperor in Beijing in China. The Emperor of China and the King of France both ruled for a very long period in the 18th century, almost more or less contemporaries. And this is a very complicated relationship. China had its borders closed off to all foreigners in the 18th century, as much as Japan did as well. But of course, there were interactions between the two countries and there were exchanges, mostly linked to the figures of Jesuit priests. Jesuits had established missions in China all the way to the origins of the Jesuit order with St. Francis Xavier, who went to China himself. And there were both French Jesuits living in China and Chinese men who took Christian orders, converted, and became Jesuit priests. The Jesuits favored most of these exchanges, but even though China was closed effectively to foreigners, there were a lot of diplomatic missions, more or less official, during the reign of Louis XV. And the Emperor of China, the Qianlong Emperor, was also particularly interested in European art. So while we think of the 18th century as being the period in which chinoiserie, as we now call it, is invented in Europe, and that is anything produced in France, but also in England, Italy, a number of other countries, with a sort of Chinese inspiration, in the same way, China was at the same time producing objects and architecture with a very strong European approach. So the Qianlong Emperor was interested in European art and architecture, and even though all of the official ceremonies of the imperial court took place in what we now know as the Forbidden City in the center of Beijing, he actually lived in what was known as the Old Summer Palace outside of Beijing, Yuanming Yuan, which was a series of buildings, of pavilions, of buildings, many of which had a sort of strange combination of European and Chinese architecture. This is one of them, one of the most celebrated ones. Unfortunately, this entire complex was destroyed by Europeans in 1860 during the Second Opium War, when French and English troops demolished over a period of a few days the entire palace. And here you see an image of the ruins of Yuanming Yuan as they remain today outside of Beijing. The relationship between the King of France and the Emperor was based on a series of gifts. And these gifts were semi-diplomatic gifts. For official diplomacy to take its course, it would have been quite complicated because the gift-giving regime was very much ruled by a series of regulations to do with the status of one ruler versus another. So it was difficult for both the emperor and the king to provide gifts first, and implying to some degree a level of inferiority to the other ruler. So many of these gifts that were exchanged were actually transmitted through a series of very complicated semi-diplomatic routes, and the Jesuits were very much part of this exchange. The first important case is a series of tapestries, which were based on designs by François Boucher. Boucher in 1742 exhibits these models for Chinese tapestries at the Salon in Paris. This is one of them. And as I mentioned in an episode of Cocktails with a Curator before, when I spoke about François Boucher's Lady on a Daybed, last year there was a wonderful exhibition in Besançon, which actually looked at Boucher and China. And the set of tapestries from a number of different places was reunited with the models, which are usually in the museum in Besançon. And here you see an installation of that exhibition. The tapestries were woven at Beauvais and in the 1760s were sent to China. And after a series of long diplomatic exchanges, they finally reached the emperor, who actually loved them so much that he built an entire pavilion at Yuan called the Observatory of Distant Oceans. And in the Observatory of Distant Oceans, he placed this incredible set of tapestries by Boucher. The person who was responsible for this idea was the Secretary of State of Louis XV, a man called Henri Léonard Bertin. And you see him here in a portrait by Porcelain. He was not only the Secretary of State, but he was also the Commissaire du Roi for a number of manufactories, state manufactories. He was in charge of the textile production in Lyon, of the Beauvais factory of tapestries, but more importantly for us today, the Sèvres manufactory of porcelain. Porcelain came to France from China and Japan all the way from the Renaissance onwards. And as many other countries in Europe, France tried to create porcelain. They were beaten by the Germans, by the Saxons. And of course, we know that the first European porcelain is produced in Dresden at Meissen in the early 18th century. But soon after, other countries managed to get the recipe for porcelain and produce their own factories. The first factory in France starts in 1740 in the Château de Vincennes, which is outside of Paris, to the east of Paris. And only 5 years later, this woman, here portrayed by Boucher, Madame de Pompadour, becomes the mistress of Louis XV. Madame de Pompadour is fascinated by porcelain. She becomes very involved in the manufactory at Vincennes, and she is one of the people responsible for the move of the factory from Vincennes in 1756 to Sèvres. And Sèvres is to the west of Paris, halfway more or less between Paris and Versailles. So the idea is to move this manufactory closer to the center of the court. Madame de Pompadour is an ardent admirer of Sèvres. She commissions a huge amount of objects for herself, for the court, for the king, for diplomatic gifts throughout her life. And just to give you a sense of some of these, here is a beautiful potpourri made for Madame de Pompadour. This is now at the Metropolitan Museum. And you see this extraordinary shape. Sèvres is particularly wonderful because of these very odd shapes of vessels and objects, very inventive, very creative, often covered in flowers. Madame de Pompadour was a particular lover of flowers, and she collected porcelain flowers produced in Vincennes first and then at Sèvres. The painting on these objects was also very extraordinary and very elegant, and created by a series of painters who collaborated with the porcelain manufactory. Sèvres was also famous for its colors, its particular greens. Its most famous color was the blue, the different types of Sèvres blue, one of which was known as the blue celeste, the sort of sky blue, and of course, the famous for us today, pink. Often these objects came as garnitures, as a set of more than one. So this is a garniture at the Frick collection, which was acquired by Henry Clay Frick and was displayed, is on display in the Boucher room. This is a so-called myrtle set because of the myrtle leaves on it. But you see how there is a central vase and two smaller ones. And these were usually displayed together on pieces of furniture or on mantelpieces. The Sèvres manufactory moved to Sèvres in 1756, and then at the end of the 19th century, it actually moved to its present location, still at Sèvres, very close to the park of the Château de Saint-Cloud, which you see here in the background. And this is the still functioning manufactory there since the late 19th century, with its ovens where the porcelain is created, and with a great museum. The National Museum of Ceramics in France is at Sèvres, and very close, attached, part of the compound of the manufactory of Sèvres. So back to Bertin. Bertin had a passion for China. He, of course, never went to China himself, but he collected Chinese objects and he collected designs of Chinese objects. And he was very interested not only in these foreign exotic objects per se, but he thought they could provide inspiration for the objects created in France. In the same way that he believed that the technology of the weavers in Lyon and at Beauvais, or the porcelain makers at Sèvres, would be things that would interest a Chinese public. So even though, as I mentioned at the beginning, the borders between the two countries were effectively closed, there was this hope of exchanging achievements in the field of the arts and creating beautiful objects between the two countries. And clearly both Louis XV and the Qianlong Emperor were very interested in this. So Bertin commissions a series of drawings of Chinese objects, which are sent to him from China. And there are volumes of these beautiful drawings of vases and various objects. And he collected these and used these for inspiration for these manufactories. But in 1767, he receives a set of 40 volumes of woodcuts that were produced for the Qianlong Emperor, showing all the great objects of the Imperial Chinese collection. This was an enterprise which took many years in China between 1749 and 1755. And as far as we know, Bertin was the only person in Europe who owned a set of these volumes. These reached Bertin, and Bertin, of course, started using them and being interested in them to produce objects in France. And in his role as commissaire de roi for Sèvres, he used this specific woodcut for the object we have at the Frick. And you see immediately the relationship between these two objects, the one on the left in the woodcut, the Chinese object, and the Sèvres produced vase on the right. Now, the vase on the left, however, was not a porcelain vase. This was a yew vase, which was actually made out of bronze. So a solid metal vase, which was produced during the period of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty goes from around 206 before Christ to 220 AD. So this was an ancient object by all standards by the 18th century. But Bertin follows it in the most detailed parts to create this vase for Sèvres. Two other vases like the Vase Japon at the Frick exist, and these were acquired recently by the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, and they're in Abu Dhabi. But you can see that the difference is that these two don't actually have the chains that the Frick object has. But you see more directly the shape of the vase, the porcelain part, and the decoration on it. First of all, the red color, the sort of coral, beautiful color, it's actually a very strange color for Sèvres. There aren't a lot of pieces of porcelain of Sèvres with this color. The blues, the greens, the pinks were clearly more common than this sort of red. The pattern on it, the gilded pattern, follows the pattern of the bronze yew vase that Bertin knew from the woodcut. The object here was decorated, painted, gilt by Jean-Armand, who was the gilder and painter at the time at Sèvres. And these are the sort of objects that Fallot was creating in the 1770s at Sèvres. And you can see how different these are from the Vase Japon, which, of course, it's different in shape and in decoration. The Frick Vase Japon, as I mentioned, has the chains, and the chains appear, of course, also in the woodcut. And these were made by Charles Huizil, who was became the goldsmith of King Louis XVI after 1784, so just before the Revolution. And this is to give you another sense of an object by this goldsmith. This is a little snuff box made by him. But he was someone who produced these sort of elegant, small objects of sort of goldsmith work. But he also produces the chains for the Frick's Vase Japon. So this vase was produced, and a set of a garniture with the Vase Japon. So we presume a set of probably 3 vases, one maybe with chains, 2 without, was given to the king. And in 1785, so several years after the vase had been created, around 1774, Bertin decides to commission 2 more sets to give to the Qianlong emperor. But Sèvres cannot produce them in time. The embassy that's going to China is leaving early. And so finally, it is decided that the king's own set is to be sent to Beijing, to the Qianlong emperor. And we don't know what happens to those objects. Are they still somewhere in Beijing? Were they destroyed when Yuan Ming Yuan was destroyed in 1860? There's no trace of them. Clearly, Sèvres continued to produce these vases, and the one at the Frick is a unique piece. We don't know of any other example of this vase existing today with the chains and with this level of quality. As I said, the only other 2 are the ones at Abu Dhabi, which of course don't have the chains and so are somewhat slightly different. So the Vase Japon, even though its name is particularly misleading, is a fascinating example of this complicated and somewhat wonderful relationship between these 2 countries based on a lot of misunderstandings. And actually, the curiosity of France towards China and the curiosity of China towards France is perfectly embodied in this beautiful object. So I hope you will pay some attention to it when you come next to the Frick and focus on this extraordinary story. I hope you're enjoying your Long Island iced tea and look forward to seeing you next week.